All right, so the title for today's lecture, oh, I'm getting quite an echo. Hold on for a moment. Let me fix that. Okay, I think we are good to go now. So, welcome to the Halloween lecture, the lecture that is just 3 days before a national election that we have been spending an awful lot of time thinking about, analyzing, preparing for. And so in today's lecture, I'm going to speak with you about 7 possible scenarios that could play out in the election starting on Tuesday and then in the days and weeks to follow. And so these have to do with the turnout rate, whether or not there's going to be voter suppression, whether or not this election might end up in the court. And as I put it in the title, other tricks or treats in the election of 2020. And I want to start out by just bringing you up to speed. You know that I like pulling averages and complex models for how the election is going to turn out. And what I see in the current models is that Biden is strongly favored to win the election. His chance of winning the election is about 9 in 10, 90%. That Trump's chance of winning the election is about 10%. And that's not a negligible chance. So let's not assume by any stretch that this is over, but that going into the final weekend before the election, Biden is in a strong position as far as the polling data is concerned. And what we can see when we look at this and the way in which, of course, this is decided at the state by state level, that either things are pretty stable or if anything, they're moving a little bit in Biden's direction. Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, all states that lean in the Republican direction or are very much toss-up states are currently, based on the polling averages, states that Biden is favored to win. But having said that, they're relatively narrow leads that Biden has in those states, less than a percentage point or a percentage point or at most 2 percentage points. And so really the critical states in the election are the states that Biden must win or that Trump must win. And I think the focus, as you might see from the travel schedule today, should be on Pennsylvania. And that is because it's very difficult to envision a scenario in which Donald Trump wins the election if he doesn't win the Pennsylvania Electoral College delegates. And on the other hand, it's difficult to conceive of Biden losing the election if he wins Pennsylvania, especially if he wins it decisively, because that probably means he's winning other states as well. And the current lead that Biden has in Pennsylvania is about 4 to 5 percentage points. And so that's over the margin of error in polls, but it's certainly not as comfortable a lead as he has in some of the neighboring states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan, where he's up at around 6 or 7 percentage points leading the polls. And so it does appear, in a sense, as is often the case, that what's going to occur in this election will be decided by what occurs in swing states, and that Pennsylvania is the most likely of the states to be the tipping point state, the state that the candidates can't win the election without winning. When we look at what's been happening in the movement in the forecast of who's going to win the election, if you could see the diagram, and I know that most of you are not looking at it right now, but if you could see the diagram, I've done something funny for Halloween, which is to give you the indication of how the forecast has changed, but also to display it to you upside down. And the reason I display it to you upside down is because, in a sense, one would anticipate more or less the opposite of what we're seeing right now. And that's in 2 regards. First of all, Donald Trump is an incumbent president. And generally speaking, in American politics, incumbent presidents win re-election. But what we're seeing right now is Biden heavily favored to unseat an incumbent. And the second thing that is unusual is that usually we would expect the race to tighten as it gets closer to election day, that stray voters would come home to their core political identity, as voters have tended to do in the past. And so that it would be a narrowing of the divide. But what we're seeing as opposed to that is a widening of the divide. And this has gone on consistently since the beginning of September, since the nominating conventions. And so there's some things that need to be explained, and some things that might lead us to be a little bit skeptical of some of what we're seeing in the polling data. When we shift to the Electoral College proper, what we see is three scenarios. One of them is where we just give the votes of each state where one or the other candidate has a clear lead, and don't count the undecided states. And using that methodology, Biden wins the presidency with roughly 326 Electoral College votes, probably more than that unless all of the undecided states go in Trump's direction. Another scenario would be where just the polls are perfectly accurate, and that's unlikely, though we're getting closer to the election, and so our confidence in these polls generally goes up. And in that scenario, Biden wins a fairly handy victory, maybe even a landslide, 357 Electoral College votes. In the final scenario, we assume the polls are quite off, that they are biased against Trump as they were in 2016, and that as a result, we need to correct the errors in the polls, or the vote comes out differently from how the polls are predicting. Even in that scenario, in which we give on average roughly 3 percentage points to the president, he still loses a narrow victory. And we'll return to that narrow victory scenario as one of the important scenarios in the election. So in a sense, we have 3 scenarios here, depending upon how accurate the polls are. If we do an average, it looks like Biden should get around 350 Electoral College votes. Finally, if we average the popular vote for the nation, and this is not how the election is decided, but it does give us one, I think, relevant piece of information. How many people are likely to vote for Joe Biden? And what we see is that around 53% of the people, based on the average of the polls that have been conducted recently, are likely to vote for Biden, and around 45% for Trump. And what that means, of course, is that Biden has an 8 percentage point lead in the popular vote. And I just want to say 2 things. That would be as big a victory as we've really seen in a generation or 2 in American politics. That would be a decisive victory in the popular vote. It doesn't necessarily directly translate into a decisive victory in the Electoral College, but it would indicate that public opinion really has moved in the direction of one candidate. The second thing I would point out to you is that we are likely to have more than 150 million people voting in this election. Again, unprecedented number. And one of the things that means is if 8% more vote for Biden, that Biden will win the popular vote by between 10 and 15 million votes, if this is accurate. And that's obviously a much larger popular vote victory than Hillary Clinton had in 2016, when she narrowly won the popular vote by 3 million, but lost the Electoral College vote. Next thing I want to show you for a moment is what's happening with the Senate. And in a sense, I want to say to you, we should be every bit as much focused on the Senate as we are on the presidency. And the Senate race is closer. It's about 75% chance that the Democrats will control the Senate, about a 25% chance that the Republicans will. And if the Democrats control the Senate, the likelihood is that they will get 52 seats in the Senate. But it's certainly imaginable that they will get 50 seats or 49 seats instead of 52 seats. I'll show you the details on this in a moment. But the reason it seems to me that we are making a mistake if we neglect the Senate in thinking about the national election, and not just the Senate race in New York or California or whatever state we happen to live in, but the overall national battle for the control of the Senate, is that we know what it looks like to have a Democratic president and a Republican controlled Senate. We've seen that with Mitch McConnell as the majority leader under Barack Obama. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that McConnell would be any less obstructionist under a President Biden than he was under President Obama. And so in a sense, the capacity for President Biden, assuming that's who wins the election, now I'm obviously speaking hypothetically, but Biden's capacity to get much of his legislative agenda accomplished really depends on what happens in the Senate. And so then if we look at the Senate map, what we can see is why the Democrats are favored. They clearly have a lead, either a fairly safe lead or a likely lead, or at least a lean in 49 races right now. And that includes Maine and Colorado and Arizona, all of which are states that are currently represented by Republicans in the Senate. And so those would be flips. On the other hand, there's a likely flip for the Republicans in Alabama. But when we look at the 5 undecided races, 2 of them are in Georgia because there's a special race there. One of them is in North Carolina, one of them is in Iowa, one of them is in Montana. Those are all currently controlled by Republicans. So if 1 or 2 of those currently too close to call or toss up elections for the Senate goes the way of the Democrats, then the Democrats have control of the Senate. That's, in a sense, it seems to me, almost as important as who wins the presidency. What happens in Iowa, North Carolina, Georgia, or Montana? Now, very quick review of a diagram I've shown you before. I just want to point out that there is strongly disproportionate representation in the Senate as compared to the populace of the country, right? And so what you can see here is that you have 62 senators representing 25% of the population, and 6 senators representing 25% of the population. And the less populous states tend to be older, whiter, more conservative. And so in a sense, again, it speaks to the oddity of this election that the Democrats actually have a chance of controlling the Senate in this election. And of course, one of the things that the Senate and disproportionate representation in the Senate does is it skews the ideology of the Senate considerably to the right compared with the American electorate as a whole. Again, this is meant to be a review, but why it is that we shouldn't be neglecting the Senate. Now, here's the I think, basic issue in this election, the core decisive issue. And what we're seeing in the country with the coronavirus today is record cases, right? 90,000 new people contracting the virus in a day, 75,000 on average contracting the virus last week. And what that means is that we are breaking our records for viral transmission. And of course, we have the President of the United States making his closing argument, declaring that we have turned the corner, or we are about to turn the corner on the virus. And so part of the difficulty that Donald Trump is having is that he has settled on a strategy that involves getting people to deny or neglect the reality all around them, which is that the virus is spreading and the virus continues to be deadly, or at least extremely destructive. And as we can see, the virus is shattering records across the country, but especially in Midwestern states where the president has to win in order to have a viable path to electoral college victory. And I'll just point out to you that although things are in terrible shape with regards to the virus in many of these states, there's no indication yet that we're nearing the peak. That is to say, that the transmission is going to subside or at least level off. And we're seeing not only records in transmission of the virus, but also in hospitalization for the virus. And this is, I think, a really good indication that we are absolutely not out of the woods with regards to this virus. And because the majority of Americans do not approve of the president's handling of the virus, because as we've seen in the past, as the virus gets worse, more Republicans and more independents actually disapprove of the president's handling of it. It seems very difficult for the president to make a convincing case for his reelection in these circumstances. And of course, Joe Biden is doing everything in his power to direct all attention on this. Now, we did have a major development last week, which is we got the third quarter economic growth data. And what we saw was in fact record-breaking growth for the American economy in the third quarter of 2020. And this is obviously good news, both for America as a whole and for the president. But I think it has to be contextualized. And so the first thing to notice is if you look at the data, what the very rapid growth over the summer indicates is that we are on our way back to where we were before the virus outbreak occurred, but we're not all the way there by any stretch. And of course, we should, if we were experiencing economic growth, be doing better than we were last year. And when we look at this in terms of jobs in particular, as well as spending, what we see is that this is a uniquely steep economic contraction. We fell off a cliff, and that we are only gradually picking back up, and that it depends on which sector you're looking at, that services are still way down in terms of purchases and in terms of employment. And I'm sorry to say this, but I do anticipate, I think we all should anticipate that as the virus roars back, economic growth will slow down again into contraction territory. It's very hard to get people to spend money if they're losing their jobs, if they are unable to travel, unable to go out to eat, unable to shop, unable to send their kids to school. And please note, right, Europe is in the middle of locking down right now. They're a little further ahead in the current wave of the virus than we are. But I anticipate that many of the states and perhaps the nation as a whole will be adopting similar measures soon. And of course, this will impose further economic pain, but it is absolutely what is required in order to manage the virus. You manage the virus first, and then the economy can recover. If you don't successfully manage the virus, the lesson from the great pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1917, 1918, the lesson of the first waves of this pandemic is that you cannot have a successful economic recovery until the virus is under control. All right, so I now want to give you just a couple of quick caveats about everything I've been saying so far. What have I said so far? That Joe Biden is clearly favored to win this election, that the Democrats in the Senate have a high likelihood of winning as well, though not as high as Joe Biden's, and that the reason for this is primarily due to the coronavirus, the fact that it's coming back, the fact that the president is blamed for mismanaging it, and the fact that the economic consequences of the virus, in addition to the public health consequences, are being felt broadly throughout the country. So, how confident should we be in all these polls? And I want to give you two cautions before we get into the scenarios. The first caution is that we are witnessing higher levels of voter enthusiasm and turnout than we have seen perhaps ever in modern American history. And that when polls are made, they are built on assumptions about voting behavior, who's likely to vote, who's less likely to vote. And we don't know if the electorate is being transformed. We know that white Americans vote at higher rates than Black and Latino Americans, that older Americans vote at higher rates than less well-educated voters, that than younger voters, that better educated voters vote at higher rates than less well-educated voters. 2016, some of those trends didn't hold. And that's part of the reason that the polls underestimated Donald Trump's chances of winning the election. If the electorate again changes, if the ground shifts underneath our feet, we cannot be as confident in what the polls are predicting. I'll give you some more information on enthusiasm and its implications in just a couple of minutes. But first, I want to also note one other assumption that polls make, or that the use of polls to predict electoral outcomes relies on. And that is that there is no, quote, mischief in the election, which is to say that the voters who want to are able to vote, and that their votes are accurately counted, and that those votes then determine the outcome of the election. And in a sense, this is obvious. It doesn't need to be explained most of the time. But I think in 2020, we do have to wonder aloud, and in fact, be concerned. Is it possible that mischief will occur in this election cycle, that it won't be the case that every vote is counted, or that the votes determine the outcome of the election? And so that's to get into some of these scenarios. But first, like I said, I want to speak with you a little bit about the enthusiasm, the participation, the rate of voting. And so the first thing to see is that in 2020, we have more voters than we've had at any point in this century who consider the current election to be the most important election in their lifetime, right? And the data that I'm showing you says who says this really matters, who wins, and who says it doesn't really matter very much. And in 2000, right, in the election between Gore and Bush, there were almost as many people who said the election won't really make that much of a difference as people who said the election will make a big difference. In every election since then, there have been many more people who think that it really matters who wins, but 2020 is off the charts with regards to the disparity between who thinks it's going to really matter who wins, and that's 80% of the population, and who thinks it doesn't make that much of a difference, and that's about 10% of the population. And so we've gone from almost 1-to-1 to 8-to-1 ratio of people who think things really matter in this election. And this then is being referred to as an existential election. That the reason people think this election matters so much, and in particular whether Trump wins or Biden wins, is they think it will determine the existential identity of the country, the very nature of America going forward. That Joe Biden has repeated Barack Obama's line on many occasions, right? That democracy itself is on the ballot in 2020, that Donald Trump has authoritarian tendencies, that he has managed to surround himself now almost exclusively with people who he can bend to his will, that the people who were in his administration in the early years, who maybe checked his authoritarian tendencies, are no longer in the administration. And so that 4 more years of Donald Trump might damage democracy itself in the United States. On the other hand, Donald Trump says repeatedly on the stump that if Joe Biden wins, America will become a radical socialist country, that Joe Biden is not in control of his own agenda, that he is in fact captured by the radical left in the Democratic Party, which he associates with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? And that Biden may appear to be a moderate in the way he presents himself and historically, but when it comes to him being president, he will be the puppet of socialist leftists in the United States, and the suburbs and the economy, the free enterprise system are all in danger if Biden is elected. And so we have a lot of enthusiasm because we have a lot of people believing that the very character of the country depends on who wins this election. And we can see this in a couple different ways. One of them is just in the sheer number of people voting. And what we have right now is roughly 90 million people having voted. And that's about 2/3 the total who have voted in 2016. And of course, we're still a few days from election day. Now, that's in part because more people are voting early because of the pandemic. But it also seems to be a very good indication that voter turnout, voter participation is much higher in 2020. We are anticipating that 150 million or more people will vote, which will be an all-time record for the United States. When we ask people how enthusiastic they are about voting in this election, when compared to the previous election, we see that people are more enthusiastic about voting in 2020 than they were in 2016 by far. Frankly, more enthusiastic than perhaps any election since 2008 when Barack Obama was the candidate. We also notice when we look at this data that there's definitely a partisan tilt to the data, which is to say that Democrats are more enthusiastic than Republicans. And that isn't uniformly the case. As a matter of fact, in 2016, Republicans were a little bit more enthusiastic than Democrats. It is often the case that the party that has the incumbent has less enthusiasm. So also in 2012, the Republicans were more enthusiastic than the Democrats. But the Democrats in 2020 are more enthusiastic than the Republicans. This is driving turnout, and it's driving turnout across the country, but especially in the battleground states. And so what we can see is that 31 million people have already voted in the battleground states. And that's a lot more than have voted in the states that are likely Biden states or likely Trump states. And so people are really coming out to vote in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, because they know that the outcome of the election is in their hands, and they believe that the future of the country depends on the outcome of the election. And just to be clear, right, this means that we may not be able to predict as accurately based on the polls how this election is actually going to turn out if we miss important trends, if younger people vote at higher rates than we think they will, or if less well-educated people vote at higher rates, or if non-white voters vote at higher rates. If we buck some of these trends, then we may have built our models on fallacious assumptions and be surprised by what happens on election day. Now, I'll just point out to you something I pointed out to you before, which is to say, given the way in which the Electoral College operates right now, and this has not always been the case by any stretch. This is a peculiarity of demographics. But given the way the Electoral College operates, the Democrats need a substantial margin of victory in the popular vote to have a fairly reliable chance of getting the Electoral College vote. And so in a sense, it's good news for Biden that he has an 8 percentage point lead in the polls right now, because that's what it looks like he needs to be fairly secure in the idea that he has an Electoral College victory. And hence, if the polls are off, if we're missing trends in voting behavior, we may very well be surprised on Tuesday by what happens. I want to now transition into talking about these scenarios. And so let me go directly to the scenarios. And I'm going to go in ascending order from the least to the most troublesome scenario. And so I think the least troublesome scenario is that the election goes off quite smoothly, peacefully. There's little disruption in the actual casting of votes. And not only that, but there's a decisive, clear, and hard to deny outcome that emerges quickly on Tuesday night or Wednesday. And I think the place to be looking at is especially Florida. Florida is counting its absentee ballots right now, right? Some states like Pennsylvania are not allowed to count them until election day, and they are probably going to be overwhelmed and so not be able to give us a clear result on Tuesday night. But if on Tuesday night we see that Florida has gone decisively to Joe Biden, I don't see a good scenario in which Donald Trump can win this election, right? And so that would be one scenario. If on the other hand, we see on Tuesday night that Florida and Michigan have gone, and maybe Arizona too, decisively to Donald Trump, then there's no scenario for Joe Biden. And so we know the results Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. And I just want to add parenthetically that among the factors that makes this a smooth and clear-cut outcome to the election would be that all mainstream media outlets acknowledge the outcome. And so CNN and MSNBC and Fox News all say the same thing at more or less the same time. Second scenario, and this is one that, again, I don't think is much trouble for American democracy, and that is a narrow Trump victory. And when I say that, I don't mean that I think 4 more years of Donald Trump would be good for the country. What I mean is that we would know the outcome on Tuesday or Wednesday. And to be clear, part of the reason I don't think that this is as much of a problem is that I don't think Joe Biden would dispute this outcome. He would acknowledge it. And so in that sense, if the leader, if the candidate says, I concede, the supporters of the candidate may be very unhappy. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Trump wins, that there will be substantial protests in the streets. But those protests will not be of a kind that tries to overturn the election result so much as to express anger and disgust at that result. So that's the second scenario. A third scenario is a Biden victory, but a narrow victory, and in particular with what people who are talking about this election are calling a red mirage and a blue shift. So let me explain, right? As I've already mentioned, Pennsylvania has by statute no power to count the votes that come in as absentee ballots or by mail ballots in till Tuesday. And I can show you, let me see if I can show you this quickly. Yes, when we look at the Democrats who are, I'm sorry, let me put it differently. When we look at who is requesting a mail-in ballot, what we see is that in many states, especially Pennsylvania, it's 2 to 3 to 1 Democrats over Republicans. President Trump has encouraged Republicans to vote in person. Joe Biden has encouraged Democrats to vote by mail, and it looks like they are following their party's lead. And so Democrats, it looks like 65% of them in Pennsylvania have requested mail-in ballots. Only 24% of Republicans have. And the result is that it's entirely possible that when we get the early results on Tuesday night, it will appear that Donald Trump is in the lead in a state like Pennsylvania or other states that are better able to count their in-person votes than their mail-in ballots. But over the next few days, as those ballots arrive in the mail, as the state counts them, we will see a shift in the direction of Joe Biden. And so if the victory by Biden is narrow and isn't clear Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, but is eventually clear, will it be acknowledged or disputed by Trump and by his supporters, especially in the media? And that's the third scenario. And I know I've left you with a question there, but I think in a sense, right, whether it's acknowledged or not depends in part on some of these other factors. But with the third scenario, we definitely have to consider the possibility that although once all the ballots are counted, it is clear that Biden has won the kind of victory necessary in order to win the Electoral College vote, the president or his supporters deny the legitimacy of the outcome because it looked like they had won on election night and because they cast suspicion on mail-in ballots, suggesting that this is an effort to steal the election. All right, fourth scenario, and then we are going up the ladder of scariness on Halloween Day, is that there are significant disruptions or violence on or around election day. And frankly, depending on how this plays out, this could be the scariest scenario. One very scary scenario would be that foreign countries, Russia or Iran or North Korea or China, successfully hack the election infrastructure of the United States. And they leave evidence, perhaps deliberately, that they've got inside our election system to cast doubt on the reliability of the outcomes, or they actually change votes, or they actually take the election machines offline so that they can't work anymore, right? That would be one scenario in which the election as a whole is disrupted. It cannot be successfully conducted. Another scenario would be one in which there is violence at the polling places, that militias or other groups turn out with guns or arms or violent intent, or even if it's not intentional, that there are conflicts between protesters that end up with skirmishes and the police have to be called in. And that as a result, there's some doubt as to whether or not everybody who wanted to vote was able to vote, and whether or not, therefore, the outcomes of the vote should be trusted. So that's a fourth scenario. The fifth scenario is that it's unclear what happened in one or more of the battleground states. And again, I think Pennsylvania is the place that we should be concentrating on, in part because, as you may have seen in the last week, the Supreme Court has twice looked at a disputed issue in Pennsylvania election law. The issue is whether or not Pennsylvania can count ballots that were mailed by election day but not received by election day. And as the current statute reads, they cannot count those ballots. But the director of elections for the state of Pennsylvania has said that they will count those ballots. And so the Republicans have gone to court to try to prevent this. The Supreme Court twice deadlocked 4-4 on this issue, the second time after Justice Barrett had been appointed, but she did not have sufficient time to come up to speed on the issues. And so it is entirely likely that the Supreme Court will issue a decision after the election about how Pennsylvania should count absentee ballots. Now, it may be that that's an irrelevant decision for the outcome of the vote in Pennsylvania. It may be a minor footnote. But if there's a razor-thin margin in Pennsylvania, if it turns out that counting those absentee ballots might change the outcome of the election, we are back in the situation where we are in 2000, in which ultimately it's a Supreme Court decision that determines the outcome of the presidential election. And I want to say, I think this is another terrible scenario. And it's a terrible scenario because it stresses the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court has to determine the outcome of a partisan contest in electoral politics, it's very difficult not to view the Supreme Court itself as a partisan institution. And of course, we've just had several bitter confirmation contests with 3 new appointees to the Supreme Court. One of them, a justice who died while Barack Obama was still president, and then he was denied the capacity to appoint his successor. Another, a justice who died just months ago as votes were already being cast in this election and has already been replaced, right? And so a real concern that the Supreme Court is not above the partisan fray, but has been pulled down into it in American politics. And if it then has to decide a case that decides the outcome of the election, it damages both democracy and the court at a moment where we could use a clear-cut indication of what the people's will is and a court that appears to not be a partisan institution. Sixth scenario, and we're just 2 from the end here, is a 12th Amendment scenario. And as you may already be aware, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution envisions a scenario in which the Electoral College is hung or deadlocked or unable to determine the outcome of the election. And in that scenario, the House of Representatives is then tasked with determining the next president of the United States. But the House of Representatives votes on a state-by-state basis, 1 vote per state. And so it, of course, depends on the composition of the delegations. And so to be clear, there is a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives right now. But because states like Wyoming have only 1 member of the House, whereas states like California have 20 representatives in the House, right? It's proportional to their population. The majority does not reflect the fact that each state has aligned with that majority. As a matter of fact, as it is right now, Republicans have a majority of the states represented in the House of Representatives. But according to the Constitution, the new congressional delegation would have to be seated. And that means we won't know until the outcome of the elections whether this favors the Democrats or the Republicans. But I want to be clear, this would be a huge mess, right? How do we get to this scenario? Well, it would have to be, for instance, that Pennsylvania has two delegations to the Electoral College, one appointed by its legislature, another claiming to be duly elected by the people of Pennsylvania, because there's so many problems with the Pennsylvania vote that the legislature decides that it cannot validate the outcome of the election. This would be a nightmare scenario if it appears that Biden won the popular vote in Pennsylvania, but the Pennsylvania state legislature, controlled by Republicans, appoints electors to the Electoral College that are going to vote for President Trump, right? And so, right, another really messy scenario in which it increasingly becomes difficult to view the outcome of the election as having clearly decided the next president of the United States. The seventh and final scenario builds on some of these other scenarios. If there are significant disruptions or violence on election day, if there is this red mirage and blue shift in which it appears that Trump is ahead in important states on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, but then that's eroded by mail-in voting. And Donald Trump says, but the mail-in voting is corrupt. We can't trust it. It doesn't have integrity. And he then attempts to deny the legitimacy of the outcomes of the election. And we could call this an attempted coup, right? The idea being that the president of the United States would say, this election did not determine what it appears to have determined. I did not lose, and I will continue for another 4 years. I have to say, there is worry about the scenario, particularly among people on the left. My old colleague, Ron Susskind, some of you may see, has a piece in the New York Times today describing this kind of scenario. But I have to say, I don't think it's very likely. And by the way, the scarier scenarios that I've sketched for you, I really don't think they're terribly likely. I think that the ones that are most likely are the fourth or the fifth scenario in which there's some disruption or violence. And that's an alarm bell. The fact that on the eve of an election, we aren't sure we can protect ourselves against foreign interference, or we're worried that there will be protests that will spill over into violence, right? That's an indication that all is not well, that we need to do more to harden and protect our electoral infrastructure from foreign interference, and that we need to do more to de-escalate our political divisions, I think, is one of the absolutely clear implications of the fact that we're worried about this scenario 3 days before an election is occurring. Similarly, I think that we should be worried that there could be unclear results, and this might end up in the courts. But the 12th Amendment scenario, the presidential coup scenario, I have to be honest with you, it seems to me that at that point, there are enough checks on the president, including in the federal judiciary. And here I want to be clear, right? The president has appointed a plurality of judges to the federal judiciary. The majority of judges on the Supreme Court and in the judiciary have been appointed by Republicans, in part because of the way in which Republicans are disproportionately represented in the Senate, and the fact that the Senate has the advise and consent power under the Constitution. But I do not believe that the judges that populate the federal judiciary are pure partisans. I may sharply disagree with aspects of their legal philosophy, including their constitutional interpretation. It pains me that they will likely be a check in important respects on the rights of Americans, as well as the legislative latitude that we have for a coming generation or perhaps longer. But having said all of that, I also believe that these conservative jurists generally respect the rule of law. And if the president tries to do extra legal or illegal things to overturn the outcome of the election, I strongly believe that the federal judiciary, the military, the intelligence service, the Department of Justice will all be a check on him, and that he will be incapable of unilaterally overturning the outcome of an election in this country. All right, so I've given you the 7 scenarios. Let me conclude by talking about one more issue. And that is the question, as I've said, when we do projections based on polls, we assume that basically all voters will be able to vote. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely sure that that assumption holds in the United States in 2020. 40 states have cut polling locations since 2016, and many have been doing it for quite a while. We can see that in 2016, practically 1 million Americans who wanted to vote were unable to vote. And they were unable to vote because they had registration problems, because of long lines at the polling station, because they lacked IDs, or even worse, because of shenanigans in which polling stations were closed or moved, or voters got bad information in the mail or via email from trolls and hacks telling them that their polling place was in a location that was actually different than it was. And so we're already dealing with problems with Americans exercising their right of suffrage, their franchise, their ability to vote. And what we know is that in 2020, many people will vote by mail because it is a pandemic. And coming into close contact with others in a polling station is dangerous. And so what we can see is that 71% of the people who are first-time vote by mail users are Democrats. 16% are Republicans. And that in Florida, to take one example where we have some data, 2% or more of the new new voters who mail in their votes, right? New mailers, are having their ballots flagged as having some problems, whereas that's occurring for less than 1% of people who have experience using the mail-in ballot. If we look at this in terms of the age distribution, we see the younger you are, the more likely you are to vote for Biden, with 18 to 29-year-olds having a 30% advantage for Biden. And that the younger you are, the more likely it is that your ballot will be flagged in Florida, right? People who are 66 or older, only half a percentage of them, but 3 times as many of the people who are 18 to 25 are getting their ballots flagged in Florida. Finally, when we look at this by race, what we see also is that Black Americans strongly favor Biden by 81 percentage points. Hispanic voters favor Biden by 34 percentage points. White voters favor Trump by 7 percentage points. And what we see when we look at Florida and North Carolina is that white voters' ballots are being flagged, marked as having problems, at less than 1/3 the rate that Black or Hispanic voters' ballots are being called into question. And so again, in this particular election, one of the things we really have to worry about is whether or not all ballots will be counted or whether there will be a skew in the way in which the ballots are counted. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and I've left myself a few minutes for taking questions. Maury, do you have any thoughts or questions at this point?